Hi everybody. Today we wanted to just bring to light a couple things that that we've been discussing lately, and they have to do with the Colorado real estate contract. Now, a couple of the items that we want to discuss today is first the appraisal deadline, and second the loan conditions deadline. So first, the appraisal deadline. If you study the contract closely, you'll actually notice that near the end of Section 3, there's actually a new note that's been added within the past few months. And it reads that if the FHA or VA loan boxes are checked in the loan limitations section, then the appraisal deadline does not apply to FHA insured and VA guaranteed loans. Now, like I said, this note was added within the last few months, and what does this mean? Well, basically, if a buyer is using FHA or VA financing, then the appraisal deadline no longer applies. So if you're writing a contract on a property that will be using FHA or VA financing, you have the option to put that date in, and as lenders, we're going to do our best to still get the appraisal back and meet that deadline. However, there's not a legally binding requirement to meet that deadline. Part of the reason why we think that FHA and VA came out with that change is because those two loan programs do tend to have a stricter interpretation of the health and safety requirements that they require to use their financing. So our hope is that that this change will actually help reduce the number of extensions needed while you're under contract using an FHA or VA loan. But the bottom line is, with this new change, the appraisal deadline on FHA and VA loans now eliminates that date requirement.
Well, the other thing we want to talk to you about is there's a lot of debate about this. It's the loan conditions deadline. The loan conditions deadline is something that came out a few years ago, and a lot of people still thought that meant that it was a loan approval deadline. And I've talked to some people who have written a contract. We've gone through some training to say that that's just simply not the case any longer. It used to be, what that in essence did was made the lender a party to the contract, which we never were. We can't be. We don't sign it. We don't have anything to do with that. But they would put but you know, the real estate agent would write up the old contract, put a date in there, and we had to meet that approval. We had to have an approved loan by that date, or they said that the buyer's earnest money was at risk. And it used to be the very case that was true. So now they came out with this language called the loan conditions deadline. And basically what that means is that if you look at Section 5.2 of the Colorado contract to buy and sell real estate, it simply states that this is an arbitrary date. It is solely on the subjective opinion of the buyer as to whether they like the loan conditions of that they are being offered. And that has to do with the rate, the payment, the availability of that loan, a lot of different things. But basically it's there for the protection of the buyer and the buyer only. And so what that means is, yes, you could put a deadline in there of a certain amount, and at that time that deadline has to be something where the lender should be communicating with the buyer, and if the buyer is happy with the conditions that they see, then they can move forward, and their earnest money would be at risk after that deadline. But that would again mean that the buyer then took on the responsibility of saying, I've communicated with my lender has given me assurances that it's going to be moving forward and there shouldn't be any issues. But it's not a strict loan approval deadline. Now, what we encourage people to do, and we'd like to encourage anybody who's writing a real estate contract, is to try to put that deadline as close to the closing as you can. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, as a lender, it's hard for us to communicate to a buyer 2 weeks ahead of closing when we know that we just have, we're still working through the processing of the loan. It's hard for me to communicate that, yes, 100% guaranteed, I know this loan's going to get done for you. Whereas when we're closing closer to the closing date, and we've gotten maybe a conditional approval and we're working through the conditions and there's no issues, that's easier for me to say, regardless of whether we have a clear to close loan, we're very, very confident we're going to get that loan done. And that gives that buyer the assurance that they can move forward past that date and not have their earnest money to be at risk. Sometimes a seller will say, well, I want to know for sure this loan is closed well before, or this loan is approved well before we have that closing or that deadline. So they try to push to have it, 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time. Well, it just doesn't work because of the fact that there's many, many things that we have to do. Matter of fact, we're not even allowed to do them until 5 days before the closing. Like we have to call and verify, do they still work at their company? As silly as that sounds, there's been times when we found out that somebody doesn't work there anymore. And so therefore, if you're past that deadline the seller tried to impose, their money is at risk. And yet we know we don't have a clear to close on the loan. So that's what we're trying to do to make sure people are educated. In essence, people are probably still going to perceive this deadline as a loan approval deadline, even though legally it's not. It is solely there for the buyer to make a decision as to whether they want to move forward with the conditions that they have been communicated by the lender. So please keep that in mind as either as a buyer and you're working with a real estate agent, make sure you understand how that works. Or as a real estate agent, please talk to the lender, make sure that they give you a good idea as to what dates are best. But we're encouraging folks to try to move that conditions deadline closer to the closing deadline so that we can really give them some good information to make that decision on. Anyway, if you have any questions about any of this, you can certainly send us any communication via email or give us a call. But I appreciate your time, and I hope this has been helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.